That morning was especially cold at the train station. Sarah, a young woman accustomed to facing life's adversities, walked briskly towards her job, a small cafe located downtown. Her eyes were alert to every detail around her, always on guard, as life on the streets was not easy. It was then that she saw him, lying on one of the station benches, a disheveled man in dirty, torn clothes. Something about him caught Sarah's attention. He was unconscious, seemingly having slept there all night. With a compassionate heart, she approached. "Sir?" she called softly, gently touching his shoulder. "Are you okay?" The man opened his eyes slowly, confused and disoriented. Sarah realized he had no idea where he was. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse with thirst and exhaustion. "My name is Sarah," she replied, trying to stay calm. "You're at the train station. What's your name?" The man blinked several times, trying to remember, but it was useless. He didn't know. Sarah, with her kind nature, decided to help him. "Come with me," she said, offering her hand. "Let's get you something to eat and drink. Maybe it will help clear your mind." Sarah took the man to the cafe where she worked. The owner, a kind-hearted man named Peter, always willing to help, allowed him to sit at a table while Sarah prepared a hot meal. "You really don't remember anything?" Sarah asked, placing a bowl of soup and a cup of tea in front of him. "Nothing," he replied with a lost look. "It's like my mind is blank." As he ate, Sarah watched. There was something familiar about this man, but she couldn't pinpoint what. She decided to investigate later. Maybe someone in town would recognize him. That night, after her shift, Sarah decided to take the man to her home. It wasn't much, just a small rented room, but it was warm and safe. "You can stay here until we figure out who you are," she said, arranging a blanket for him. He nodded gratefully, still clearly confused and troubled. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off him, feeling that she was involved in something much bigger than she could imagine. In the following days, Sarah and the man, who came to be called John, tried to uncover the mystery of his identity. Sarah asked around in shops, at the market, and even at the police station, but no one seemed to know him. John still couldn't remember anything. One morning while Sarah was at work, a well-dressed man entered the cafe. He seemed out of place in such a simple environment. He looked around and then saw John sitting in a corner, looking out the window. "It's him!" the man exclaimed, rushing to the table. Sarah, startled, ran to intervene. The man introduced himself as Charles, a lawyer from the big city, and claimed that John was his client, a very wealthy businessman named Edward. "He disappeared weeks ago," Charles explained. "Everyone's been looking for him." Sarah couldn't believe it. The man she had rescued was a millionaire. She felt a mix of emotions, relief for having helped, but also fear of what this could mean for her. With the revelation of John's true identity, or rather Edward's, Sarah's life turned upside down. Charles insisted on taking Edward back to the big city, but he, still without memory, refused to go. "I feel safe here with Sarah," Edward said, looking into her eyes. "I don't want to go." Charles, visibly irritated, tried to convince Edward in every way, but it was useless. Sarah, for her part, was torn. She wanted Edward to regain his life, but feared losing him. "Maybe it's better if you go with him," Sarah suggested one night, as she made up the improvised bed for Edward. "It might help bring your memories back." "I don't want to go," Edward insisted. "I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be." Over time, the closeness between Sarah and Edward grew. He began to help out at the cafe, trying to adapt to his new reality, while Sarah endeavored to help him remember his past. Days passed, and Edward began to show signs of his old personality, although the memories were still fragmented. He started to recall small things: a song, a scent, the feeling of being in a certain place. Sarah noticed that each memory brought a bit more pain and confusion. "Why does it hurt so much to remember?" he asked one day as they walked through the park. "Maybe because you've lost so much," Sarah suggested, "but it could also mean you have a lot to gain now." Meanwhile, Charles didn't give up. He returned to the cafe regularly, trying to persuade Edward to return. On one of these visits, he brought a woman, Maria, who claimed to be Edward's wife. "He's my husband," she declared, holding Edward's hand tightly. "He has to come home." Sarah felt a pang in her heart. Was it true? Edward seemed even more confused, looking from Maria to Sarah, not knowing what to think. "I need time," he said finally, letting go of Maria's hand. "I need to understand what's going on." Maria's revelation brought new tension to Sarah and Edward's lives. Maria insisted he return home, while Edward felt his bond with Sarah growing stronger. One night, while Sarah prepared dinner, Edward walked into the kitchen with a determined look. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he began, sitting at the table. "I remembered something important today." Sarah stopped what she was doing and sat across from him, her heart racing. "What did you remember?" she asked anxiously. "I remembered an accident," he said, his voice trembling. "I think that's why I lost my memory. I was driving to an important meeting, something work-related, and then there was a crash. Everything went dark after that." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She was beginning to understand the depth of Edward's trauma. "That makes sense," she said, trying to stay calm. "But there are still many questions. Who was with you? Why didn't anyone come looking for you sooner?" Edward shook his head, frustrated. "I don't know. It's all so confusing." The days continued with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Sarah and Edward began to investigate the accident. They went to the police station, searched for car accident records from the time he disappeared, but everything seemed like a giant puzzle with missing pieces. One afternoon, while at the cafe, Sarah overheard a conversation between two regular customers. They were talking about a businessman involved in a major financial scandal who had mysteriously disappeared. The description matched Edward's. With this new lead, Sarah decided to dig deeper. She went to the local library and searched through old newspapers. She found an article about a businessman named Edward Mason, accused of embezzlement and missing after a car accident. "Edward, we need to talk," Sarah said that night, showing him the article. Edward read the article carefully, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. "I can't believe it," he murmured. "If this is true, I'm a criminal?" Sarah held his hand firmly. "We don't know the whole truth yet. And even if it's true, you're not the same person now. We can find out what really happened." They decided to dig deeper, trying to find anyone who could clarify the events of Edward's past. One day, Sarah received a call from an unknown number. It was a man named Henry who claimed to have information about Edward. "We need to meet in person," Henry said. "I have something important to tell you." The meeting was arranged for the park. Henry was a middle-aged man with a worried look. He told them he worked for Edward before the accident and had discovered something terrible. Edward was being framed by someone within his own company. "Edward didn't embezzle any money," Henry said. "He was trying to expose a corruption network within the company, and that's why they tried to kill him." Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with anger. They finally had a solid lead. With this new information, Edward and Sarah began to formulate a plan to reveal the truth. They decided to approach Charles, the lawyer, and tell him what they had discovered. Surprisingly, Charles sided with them, committed to helping clear the situation. "We have to be careful," Charles warned. "The people involved are powerful. We need solid evidence." Sarah suggested they look for more documents or witnesses who could corroborate Henry's story. They combed through old company files and managed to find some incriminating emails. Sarah also spoke to other former employees who confirmed the suspicions of corruption. Meanwhile, Maria continued to pressure Edward to return home. She claimed he was in danger, but Edward began to suspect she might be involved in the plot against him. "I need to trust you, Sarah," Edward said one day. "You've been the only one to help me without expecting anything in return." Sarah was touched by his trust, but knew they were dealing with something very dangerous. Finally, they decided it was time to confront Maria. They called her for a meeting at the cafe with Charles present. "We know the truth, Maria," Sarah began, her voice firm. "We know Edward was trying to expose a corruption network and that he was framed." Maria turned pale but maintained her composure. "That's ridiculous," she said, trying to sound offended. "Edward, don't listen to them. They're trying to manipulate you." But Edward, now more confident and with his memory beginning to return, looked Maria straight in the eye. "Is it true, Maria?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Maria hesitated for a moment, but then, seeing no way out, broke down in tears. "Yes, it's true," she confessed, "but I was forced. They threatened our lives. I had no choice." With Maria's confession, Edward, Sarah, and Charles felt they were finally close to solving the mystery. Charles began to compile all the evidence and prepared a dossier to present to the authorities. Meanwhile, Edward decided it was time to confront those responsible for the plot. He called one of the main suspects, Mark, Edward's former partner, and arranged a meeting under the pretense of wanting to resolve things peacefully. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, worried. "It could be dangerous." "I have to do this," Edward replied. "I need to clear my name and end this corruption network." The meeting was set at a hotel on the outskirts of town. Edward was accompanied by Charles and Sarah, who stayed in an adjacent room, ready to act if anything went wrong. When Edward entered the room, Mark was sitting, a cynical smile on his face. "Edward, you finally decided to show up," Mark said with disdain. "What do you want?" "I want to settle this once and for all," Edward replied, sitting across from him. "I know everything, Mark. I know you tried to frame me and kill me. But I survived, and now I'm going to expose the whole truth." Mark laughed, but there was a nervousness in his eyes. "You have no proof," he said, trying to sound confident. "I have more than you think," Edward retorted. "And I have witnesses. I'm not going to stop until everyone involved is brought to justice." Mark tried to intimidate Edward, but seeing that he was serious and determined, he began to despair. Finally, after a long and tense conversation, Mark agreed to a deal to expose all the other involved parties in exchange for a reduced sentence. With Mark's confession and the collected evidence, Edward and Sarah finally managed to expose the corruption network. Charles delivered the dossier to the authorities, and an investigation was launched. Several arrests were made, including high-ranking executives from Edward's company. The media quickly picked up the story, and Edward became a hero for surviving and exposing the corruption. Sarah, by his side, was recognized as the brave woman who helped him regain his life. Edward, now with his memory almost fully restored, decided it was time to start over. He sold the company, donated a significant portion of his fortune to charity, and bought a small cafe where he and Sarah began a new life together. "I never imagined my life would take this turn," he said one day, as they watched the street outside the cafe. "Neither did I," Sarah replied, smiling, "but I'm glad it did." What started as a casual encounter at the train station turned into a journey of redemption, courage, and love. Sarah and Edward, united by fate, found not only the truth, but also each other. And finally, they were able to start writing a new chapter of their lives, free from the shadows of the past and full of hope for the future.